Hey folks, Dennis here with Las Vegas Worm Farm and the Living Soul community. And it's time for our worm topic of the week. And what are we talking about this week? We're talking about adding worms to your garden. Something that I recommend all the time to a lot of people. Here's the thing. Most people add worms to soil, but they forget to build the underground home where the actual worms are going to be living. Is that you? Did you just throw worms into the ground and thought they were a magical creature and things were just going to happen? A lot of the times people think that because we say worms are so good and worms are soil engineers and they till the soil and they do all of these beneficial things like burrows where it creates water infiltration, allows oxygen to go through the soil, and it eats organic material. They do all these things. But here's the thing. If they don't have an environment to live in, they're not going to do any of those things. So you have to build an environment for those guys first. Once you have that established, then we can add those worms. Many gardeners think that worms will just survive as long as you just put them in the ground. And maybe in parts of the world that is true, maybe in Kentucky, maybe in Kansas, maybe in Ohio, maybe in Germany, maybe in places that have decent soil already. But if you put them in places like Nevada, the deserts of California, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Texas, most of Texas, and other parts of the country or the world, they're probably going to die. Here's the thing. If worms aren't there to begin with, that means the conditions aren't right for them to be able to survive, which means that you have to create those conditions in order for them to be happy and for them to thrive and do what we want them to do, which is till the soil, aerate the soil, break down organic material, and all those other fancy things like drop worm castings all over the place. We have to build an environment for those guys to be able to live, survive, and thrive first. In reality, worms thrive when they have a few things that are working together. That would be they need water to be able to breathe. They need air to be able to breathe. They need some food because they get hungry and they have to eat. And then they need some protection from the elements. Does that sound familiar? It should, because it sounds like a lot. It sounds a lot like what we talk about in the Living Soil community. Yeah, we talk about air, water, food, and microbes, right? Sounds a lot like that. Worms are no different. They need protection from the elements. They need something to fill their bellies, and then they need water to survive because they need that to be able to get oxygen through their skin. Yes, worms breathe through their skin. If you didn't know that, you're welcome. There's a new tidbit of information that you can take with you. And if you find this type of stuff interesting or useful, do me a favor, share or give this thing a like. Only about 10% of viewers actually click the like button, and that is huge because when you do, it sends this video out to other people so they can get all of this information as well. So now let's get back to it. One myth that I always hear is if you add worms, your soil will just automatically improve and get better. Nope, not gonna happen. If I take worms and I put them in my Las Vegas soil, in my native soil, well, they're gonna die. They're not gonna do anything except add more carbon to my soil. That's it. I don't need any more carbon in my soil. And I don't need dead worms. By the way, if you've never smelled worms dying, liquefying, it's awful. Ask my wife. She can't stand it. Actually, I can't stand it either. It brings in flies from all over the place. It is one of the worst smells that you will ever smell. Back on topic. You got to make the conditions right for the worms to be able to survive. You do. We got to make sure that we add mulch to the soil. We keep it irrigated. We add some organic material for them to feed on, right? And if we have those few things in place, then the worms will be kind of happy and be able to do what they need to. It'll provide a safe place for them to be able to live and survive. So what do we need as mulch? Great question. Mulch, the definition is anything that covers the soil. We kind of already talked about this in some of our other videos from last week, right? It's anything that covers the soil. In this case, if I'm using worms, I like to use organic material. I don't like to go with an inorganic material, right? Because those things don't really break down. And I want to give worms something that they can actually feed on and eat on. So what I like to do is I like to use wood chips. That's my preferred thing to go to because it sticks around for a long time. It holds a lot of moisture, and it for me it doesn't blow away. If I use straw or something like that, it usually goes away if the wind gets really if it gets windy. If you're in any place like me, we get 50, 60-mile-an-hour gusts depending on the season, and then things just blow away, trees blow over, and children go tumbling down the street. So use whatever mulch you like, but I like to use wood chips, and that's just what I do. It acts a lot like a swamp cooler in the summertime, which is fantastic because we get really high temperatures. The water comes on top, and then when the wind kind of hits it, it wicks it away, and it acts like a swamp cooler. If anybody's familiar with a swamp cooler, that's how it actually works. Additionally, these environments create a or the mulch on tops creates an environment that just makes worms kind of go crazy because it's just the right temperature, it's just the right moisture, but it's also a food source. I've noticed that worms really like to feed on fungi. They will decimate that stuff in my worm bins. So I have to continually add organic material like wood chips and high cellulose, high lignin things to kind of keep that stuff going, but it also keeps my worms fed. So that's the reason that I kind of choose that. But you can use any mulch. Anything organic really works. Anything inorganic works too, but I just like the organic stuff because it'll break down and it will keep feeding my worms. When we're adding organic material to the soil, one of the things that I like to remember is that um, if you add a lot of small particle things, it will compact. So I don't like to use things like sawdust. I don't like to use shredded paper. I use shredded cardboard instead. Can you use paper? Can you use sawdust? Yes, you can. The problem is when you add too much of that stuff, it gets really tight. And what I mean is like it turns into a rock. We make paper mache. It's basically water and newspaper, right? So if you take that and you put it into your soil, all of a sudden you create this crust in your soil, and it's hard for the worms to break through that stuff too. So not really something that I add to the soil, and it's because it creates a crust, and then you run into aeration issues and oxygen being able to flow in and out of your soil. And again, oxygen is one of those things that worms need. So I don't want to cut off the flow of oxygen. So if I'm using mulch, I will usually try to stay away from paper, and I will try to stay away from really fine things like sawdust. And if I do use them, then I use them in very small quantities. So I'm not saying you can't use them. Absolutely, you can use them. I would just use them in very small quantities and like use them sparingly all over the place. Um, it's just better that way, so you keep the soil healthy and there's enough oxygen for the worms and everybody else to kind of stay happy and breathing and I guess alive. Another option for mulch that you can use, besides those that I already mentioned, are leaves. Now, leaves are usually only available one time a year, but you can bag those up and keep those. I know some people who keep them over a longer period of time, which is fine because then you build up that leaf mold, and that leaf mold is microorganisms, and the worms will also tear through that stuff. You don't have to break it down or run it through a chipper. You can just keep it whole, or you can shred it if you want to. But that is also fantastic because the microbes love it, but then the worms love it too. Again, it's one of those organic mulches that I just really like. If we had more leaves here in the desert, I'd probably use them. It's just not one of those things that I have a lot of access to. I have an evergreen tree, and I have a lot of evergreen trees, and I don't really have any deciduous trees that I can like yank all the leaves off and add to. Not yet. Eventually they'll get big and then I'll have those, but not at the current time. Now, all of this mulch does a few things, right? Like we already talked about the moisture retention, but another thing that it does is it buffers temperature very well. If you take the temperature of a soil in the middle of summer, just bare, open, right? It's going to be pretty hot. Here in Vegas, it gets extremely hot. If you put mulch on top, it provides a buffer. It's kind of like the walls and insulation. It keeps everything a lot cooler. And like I said, with the wood chips, what it does, it acts like a swamp cooler. So when the wind blows across it, it keeps everything nice and cool underneath. Different organic material will be able to hold on to moisture better or worse depending on what it is. Um, Leaves, not so much moisture. Wood chips, more moisture. Paper, cardboard, more moisture. Uh, Food is going to have a lot of moisture in it already, right? We're not using food as mulch, but um, if you're using sticks and twigs and stuff like that as a mulch, might not be able to hold on to that much moisture, right? But these mulches, they do provide protection against these extreme temperatures, not only just hot temperatures, but also cold temperatures, right? So it acts like a blanket in the wintertime and kind of insulates everything underneath all of that snow that might be accumulating up. Now, if you get permafrost, that's a different story. Everything gets frozen, whole different shebang if we're talking about that. But for the majority of people, we're not getting permafrost, right? So the soil is just getting covered with snow and ice, and it provides a nice insulative layer. Now, we kind of already talked about food sources. I like sticking with organic material, right? Just because the worms will eventually have a food source there for them to chomp down on. You don't have to use that. You can use anything that you want. I just found that I just rather feed the soil and feed my worms all at the same time. How will the worms do? That's a question that I get quite often too. I'm going to put this mulch on my beds, and it's not going to look pretty and nice. Sometimes it doesn't. That's just how it is, right? Um, how well is this stuff going to work? It's actually going to work really well. Depending on the organic material, it might take some time to break down. Maybe it breaks down quickly, maybe it doesn't, maybe it sticks around for a little while, but it continues to feed the worms. It will continue to feed the soil. It will, and that soil will continue to feed your plants. At the end of the day, we really just want a beautiful garden with beautiful plants, right? And we can accomplish that by adding worms as long as the conditions are right, and then let them do what they usually do out in nature, which is break down organic material, cycle nutrients, and give it back to our plant, which at the end of the day is what we're trying to grow. So that's it for this week. Thanks for watching, and we'll see y'all next week.